Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update. It's kind of the second one of the 10th of December 2025. I did an update concerning Zelensky's elections gamble. I don't think it's a gamble. I think it's actually a really sensible move that he's done there. So go and check that one out. And we are in this video going to talk about what's been happening along the front lines in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. Not a lot of news coming from sort of strikes from both sides, actually, and that's a rarity. So essentially, potentially, I'm a poet and I know it, a quiet night with regard to missiles and drones. We're going to talk about potential for attacks in Sumy and even coming from Transnistria, some rumors there. We're going to talk about another Il-76 plane going down in Sudan. We're going to talk also about Zelensky's statements concerning missiles yesterday. That was very, very interesting and worthy of note. So before we get into it, please remember to like, subscribe and share. It really helps out and hopefully keeps you in the loop. Time for a cup of tea. Sip. Gulp. Now I'm prepared. Now Yorkshire tea has sorted me out. Right. Okay. Let's get into the long weeds of the details. We have the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them linked in the description below. And we're back over 1,000 personnel lost and over 100 vehicles and fuel tanks lost. That signifies to me the Russians are pushing in a number of places. High personnel, high unarmored vehicle losses. Low armored losses, tanks, one armored combat vehicle, 25 artillery systems, pretty useful there. Otherwise, not a lot to write home about. So things are evidently still pretty tasty along the front line. Quite a few videos coming out of engagements. I just saw a video of 5 Russian soldiers being taken out in the woods somewhere by, I think maybe in Donetsk region, I can't remember, by Ukrainian soldiers. I've seen all sorts of different things. I'm not particularly going to show many videos to you. We've got a couple to look at that I think are worthy, as I say, of note. Now, Syrsky has been saying a few things recently. I think he's been interviewed. He said, Ukraine is losing many of its soldiers. It's a huge pain for me, but Russia is losing many times more. If anything sums up where this war is at the moment, it's kind of that statement. It's really tough for Ukraine, but it's tougher on Russia. The problem is Russia don't care. I am my summary of where the war is at the moment is that Ukraine genuinely is desperate to do a peace deal. I think Zelensky actually wants and needs peace because the front line isn't getting any better, and actually Ukraine don't have that much in the tank to be able to. They can never do a May 2023 counteroffensive again, not in the foreseeable future. They can't amass the personnel to do that. And the shame was that 2023 counteroffensive didn't do what it needed to do by a long shot. And whether it was Zelensky's fault or Western leaders or Western military people trying to advise the Ukrainians incorrectly or a mixture of both, I don't know. Time will tell. There are different reasons as to why that went wrong. They certainly attacked, in my opinion, in the wrong place. And you're not going to see that again. So now I think Ukraine is mainly able to do active defense. So they're defending around certain areas of the front line, but trying to push back and stop the Russians from taking land. But if the Russians are going to take land, which seems to be inevitably the case, then they are going to be bled seriously for that. And so you have Ukraine losing soldiers, but Russians losing many more. But like I've talked to you many times previously, you've got Ukraine started down here, Russia started up here. Russia's accelerated its decrease, and Ukraine. So if you can see that, so Russia starts up here. It as both sides go down, they don't go down at the same level. Ukraine goes down more slowly than Russia, but Ukraine doesn't have as much to eat into down here. So Russia's taking stupendous losses, and Ukraine is taking far fewer losses, but they're far more valuable. They just have fewer people, and Russia doesn't care about their losses. And then they're going to get people from North Korea, from around the world, and that includes materiel too. And that same activity takes place with materiel as much as it does with personnel. So these pressure cooker analogies I keep talking about, Ukraine's personnel issues are really significant. But at the same time, they are having some success with targeted strikes deep into Russia, but Russia's having huge success in striking at Ukraine's energy uh, infrastructure, and they are really hurting. The Ukrainians are really hurting with their energy. So those two issues, like I keep saying, honestly, that is my thesis is being borne out very, very explicitly. Where and we're going to talk about a few comments today concerning further attacks on Ukrainians' gas infrastructure. They're really hurting with the energy infrastructure. They're really hurting with personnel, but they're hurting Russia with hydrocarbons, with sanctions, with material and personnel attrition. But they care less about that, and they've got more options to get them from elsewhere. And the good news for Ukraine is that they've got weapons coming online to a degree that I think the Russians don't necessarily, but the Russians don't need to draw on new weapons because they just need to make their existing weapons, essentially their Iskanders and their Kinjals and whatnot, and their Shahids. Ukraine need to take out those manufacturing facilities with their own missiles, and they've got new missiles coming online. I talked yesterday about the Narwhal cruise missile, 680 kilometers, 130, I think, 120, 130 kilogram warhead. That's from Czechia. That seems to be pretty close to coming online, and a whole bunch of weapons that the Ukrainians are making themselves and they're scaling up presently. So, it's precarious at the moment where the front line is suiting Russia, as in they are taking territory, but they're losing huge amounts, but they don't care about losing huge amounts. And there is this moment where Ukraine could really start hitting Russia big time, but can that happen quick enough? Because they're really hurting on the front lines. And so I think, Ukrainians are wanting peace quite desperately, but also the Russians don't seem up for peace. And so it could be back to square one. But as long as Ukrainians communicate to the Americans that it's the Russians that are not playing ball. Now, the Europeans understand this, but the Trump administration really is hating on Europe at the moment. I've just heard some more news about the national security document. Apparently had a first iteration national security strategy that was trying to peel Austria, Poland, Hungary, and one other country away, for Italy, away from Europe. So they really are gunning for Europe. And it's the national security strategy is written by a guy called, I think, it looks very JD Vancey, very, very Stephen Miller. There's a guy called somebody Baker, I think, that was behind it. It's clear that I don't think Trump's even read the national security strategy. I don't think he even wrote his own introduction. So, it's not him, it's other people behind. But what you have is Ukraine in a very difficult position, set between Europe supporting another nation, supporting Ukraine, Russia obviously against it, Russia then collecting North Korea, Iran, and China, and possibly India much more explicitly, and then the US changing sides. And Ukraine have to work out what is the best course for their people so that they don't lose entire generations of people here. And what are they going to have to make concessions that are going to be forced to make because the US isn't playing ball, is essentially change sides. But certainly from Syrsky's point of view, he's saying, look, we are painfully taking losses, but the Russians are losing many more. The question then is, well, okay, who suffers more as a result of that? Yet that attrition ratio might be massively to the benefit of Ukraine, sorry. But if Russia can go and collect a whole bunch of North Koreans, then they don't really care. So then you go to areas of the front line, and even in Pokrovsk, it's looking all right. So not all right, it's horrific. Sorry, that I didn't mean to say all right at all. What I meant to say is that what's going on in Pokrovsk and Murmansk is not what the Russians are claiming. So it is not massively encircled. It is very close to being encircled, and the Ukrainians having to try really hard to keep those lines open to get people out safely from Murmansk, but that's really difficult to equalize the front line. But it's not the disaster that Russians have claimed. And in fact, Syrsky again came out and claimed that there was a time when there were no Ukrainian soldiers in Pokrovsk, and now they are clearing out certain areas, and actually, they are holding areas of across, particularly north of the railway line, and that's okay. Thank you very much. I mean, again, it's really, really challenging, but it's not the doom that the Russians are claiming, but it's also, very, very precarious. But it's attritional, I think, for the Russians. And then you come up to Kupiansk, where Ukraine are doing sort of similar things there. Well, not quite similar, actually. They're more likely to clear the Russians out from Kupiansk here. So Ukrainian forces have retaken a significant amount of territory in the city of Kupiansk. Hundreds of Russian troops are semi-encircled, only able to leave swimming across the Oskil River, which is that blue line coming down through there. And as you can see, what the Ukrainians were trying to do, and I talked to you through this in my mapping updates, and I need to do another one today. I feel like today could be a 24-hour rolling news day. But they basically have cut the Russians off up here, which means they are going to struggle. They were already struggling to supply their main forces in Kupiansk, and actually there weren't like huge numbers of them quite often. And it's probably the same with Pokrovsk. You think that back to maybe World War II or whatever, where you're imagining thousands and thousands of troops attacking these cities. Kupiansk, there's probably, I don't know, somewhere between 60 and 150 Russian troops here, and that's it. But the Ukrainians also don't have the troops. They're spread so thinly along the front line. Their active defense is done with just meager resources. But here, the Russians, if you cut them off up the top, then they are going to struggle to supply their troops all the way down here, because you have to go across the river to supply them, and then that's just really challenging, and it's also very difficult for them to get out of Dodge if they need to. So there is a possibility that the Russians might be somewhat encircled in Kupiansk. Hundreds of Russian troops are semi-encircled, it says here, only able to leave by swimming across the Oskil. Ukraine controls 65% of Kupiansk, but weeks ago, Russia controlled nearly all of Kupiansk. Well, actually, you had Gerasimov and Putin then claiming that Kupiansk was taken, Vovchansk was taken, Pokrovsk was taken, and none of those have been taken. I think probably Vovchansk was looking one of the most precarious, to be honest. They started making large advances to the to the west of Vovchansk. Too many words, names, and places. But all of them, the Ukrainians are trying to hold on. But again, that kind of trying to hold on, and this activity here, like if Ukraine had huge resources to draw on, the Russians would easily be kicked out of Kupiansk. The Ukrainians could throw in like 2,000 to 3,000 troops here to do these clearing operations, then they surely would. And it just shows that they're trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. Like they don't have enough resources anywhere to be able to fully push the Russians, obviously, out of Pokrovsk, out of Vovchansk, and out of Kupiansk. And so they're kind of trying to do a bit everywhere, and it's never enough. But the Russians don't have huge forces themselves. And so when they do have these breakthroughs, like down in Halaipale area, then they're like, oh, we've broken through, but probably not with that many troops. And then the Ukrainians like, shite, right quick, get our emergency troops. And you've got these exhausted units that are brought into like firefight in these like really dangerous areas, or areas where it's all gone wrong. And then they can continually pull from here to there to try and stop the dam from gushing. And then that's what's happened down in Halaipale, which I think has been largely stabilized, but how robust is that stabilization? So everything is so precarious. And I think essentially, to go back to my original point, I think Zelensky realizes, of course he does, how precarious the military situation is, and that if you can get a peace negotiation that is not just a complete capitulation, then he's totally happy to go for that. But the problem is Russia, they smell blood, and they sense that the US has changed sides, and they're absolutely not up for making any concessions whatsoever. So it's down to Europe then really to support Ukraine, but then it's looking like Europe is against the rest of the world, because the US kind of then goes, we're not interested, or we're going to start helping. They seem to be capitulating in trade to China. They're capitulating to Russia in negotiations, and they're only being harsh on the tariffs for India, not because they were buying Russian oil, but because India didn't say Trump was responsible for stopping the India-Pakistan war. And so, all the craziness that's going on there, it looks like Europe is just needing to stand up for everything that's good and right in the world, but then Europe is compromised by Hungary, by influence from the United States in trying to unpick the unity of the EU, and Slovakia, and so on and so forth. And then you got AFD in Germany, Rassemblement National in France, and Reform UK in UK, and it's just that's where we're at. I'm sorry to bring this in the hits and losses video, but you need to understand where the war is and where it's going. In order to understand that, you need to have a good handle on what's going on geopolitically. Then Russia, so the rumors are, is preparing for a new stage of terror against Ukraine. The enemy plans attacks on sewage pumping stations in Sumy and nearby areas. According to monitoring channels, the attack could completely stop the drainage and cause man-made accidents and serious environmental threats. And then there's another claim, according to Channel 24 in the SPU, there is a risk of penetration of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance troops into Odessa and Vinnytsia regions in Transnistria. So this is the annexed area of Moldova, where there's 1,500 Russian troops stuck there with a whole bunch of ammunition and weaponry that the Ukrainians would love to get their hands on, and the Russians would love to get their hands on, but it's kind of stuck between Moldova and Ukraine. But they could be starting to think, the Russians, about using those people. So it says mobilization has been intensified there in Moldova, in Transnistria. Production of drones and training of operators has begun. That is a super worrying scenario, and actually fairly clever. If I was the Russians, I'd be like, yeah, let's cause the Ukrainians some issue over here. So those very thinly spread defenses are having to think about Transnistria. Anyway, as I was saying, this is Syrsky saying there were no Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk at a certain stage. At a certain stage in the autumn, there were no more of our troops in Pokrovsk. From November the 15th, we were able to take control of about 13 square kilometers of territory within Pokrovsk, out of a total area of the city of 29 square kilometers. Wow. So I didn't quite understand this. I mean, surely there can't have been a moment where they didn't have any troops in Pokrovsk when Pokrovsk was getting attacked, or is that the claim? I mean, that is just a mere less than a month ago. So had the Ukrainians been fully pushed out of Pokrovsk at one stage, and then you're back to, well, the Russians were telling the truth about Pokrovsk being taken, or so I didn't quite understand this fully. But anyway, Ministry of Defence for the UK has stated it is with deep regret that we must announce that a member of the UK Armed Forces died in Ukraine this morning, Tuesday, 9th of December. He was injured in a tragic accident whilst observing Ukrainian forces test a new defensive capability away from the front lines. Family has been notified, and our thoughts are with them at this sad and difficult time. My initial reaction was, oh, it's probably special forces doing something and being involved, maybe somewhere close to the front line, or something that needs to be sort of covered up. So our special forces are doing stuff in Ukraine and have been doing since 2014, right? But actually, that you probably wouldn't hear anything then. This might well genuinely be because there will be a lot of allied forces in Ukraine literally doing that, observing all of these new weapons being used. And the British have a bunch of their own weapons that are essentially being tested out there, like the Dragonfire laser complex, and Raven, and was it Braveheart or Graveheart? Then you got Terrorhawk, and you've got all of these systems that we've kind of made bespoke for Ukraine being used out there. We want to know how to use them in a war scenario and get the feedback from that, and then we can improve our weaponry. So that there will be lots of observers from a number of countries. You've got like interceptor drones, how you use them. We need to learn how to use them because we've got drones. I say we, Europe collectively, we have drones causing us a nuisance in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Germany, so on and so forth. So we need to be observing how to use these weapons, and these weapons are dangerous and they can go wrong and things can blow up sideways or whatever, and you are going to lose people. It's the nature of operating with explosives continually, and even stuff like getting run over by tanks, that happens. So we will have troops in Ukraine, and occasionally, unfortunately, they will be engaged in accidents. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe they were observing, but a Kinjal missile struck or Iskander struck or whatever. I don't know, but it's very sad. And of course, this could then give ammunition to people in the UK who are naysayers. I've been getting people like Andrew Bridgen, former Conservative dude, and Lembit Opik, former Lib Dem now Reform guy, who is who are on the socials slagging off the UK for supporting Ukraine and basically regurgitating Russian talking points. And they'll look at something like this and they'll use this as ammunition. So you need to be careful with that. Russians from the 82nd Motorized Rifle Regiment on the Vovchansk front, so this is going back up to Vovchansk in the Kharkiv region, are complaining about the situation at one of their positions. Of course, anecdotes, one of their, I don't know how valuable it is to show something like this, but the guy says, quote, "That's it. The temple burned down completely. Everything burned out, down to zero. There's nothing left." So the Ukrainians are still, doing this active defense. They are also using, and I've seen a number of videos that I haven't shared with you because the Russians do this times 10, or more than times 10. But the Ukrainians arguably might be more precise. I don't know. They are using their Hammer AASM 250s and similar guided glide bombs. In fact, the French have just tested a new AASM. I don't know what weight, what capacity and warhead it was, but a much bigger one. I think has just been tested by maybe the French Navy or something. But anyway, whether Ukraine will be able to get their hands on that'd be fantastic. But this could well be a result of guided glide bombs landing very close by to here and taking out lots of Russian military infrastructure there. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, Russia shot down a Su-27 over eastern Ukraine on Sunday. Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Ivanov, the pilot, was killed, sadly. It's the 19th Su-27 loss since the beginning of the war. So Ukraine may only have 12 to 23 of these left, and unlike MiGs or F-16s, no ally operates Su-27s. There's no donor pipeline. They aren't getting any of these back. So what you're seeing, I don't know if it says it here. Yeah, the maths is simple. F-16s and Mirages keep arriving, Gripens and Rafales are coming, but Ukraine's Su-27 brigades have to survive long enough for them to matter. So it's just like, eking out the old airframes to the point where they can be properly replaced by much better planes. It is challenging for the Ukrainians, but in terms of the MiGs, there is news that and I don't know why it's taken so long. The Polish have a bunch of MiG-29s. I think they're MiG-29s that they are phasing out, and the Ukrainians obviously use MiG-29 still quite a lot. They do a lot of heavy lifting, particularly with, I think, guided glide bombs. So Poland are looking to get all of their ones they phased out to Ukraine in return for drone technology and know-how and all that kind of stuff. We shall see, but they'll definitely want those MiG-29s, even though they're getting the F-16s and the Gripens and the Rafales eventually. They know how to operate MiG-29s. They've got the pilots, and actually they'll need spare parts as well. The MiG-29s they're flying are probably at the end of their lives in terms of flight hours and so on and so forth. So that's going to be very, very useful for the Ukrainians. Now, here we have news that two T-90AK, so T-90As are the, I think, original T-90. They have been improved with the T-90M, the breakthrough variety. You get the T-90S, which is the export variety. This is a T-90AK. I don't know what the K means there, but one of two known captured Russian T-90 AKs here is now in service with the Tank Battalion of Ukraine's 5th Separate Assault Brigade. After undergoing repairs, it was fitted with contact era, so explosive reactive armor. So these are the bricks on the side that explode outwards if a projectile hits the tank. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's an explosive to protect the armor behind it. And the idea is that is penetrated, and then it reacts by exploding outwards and throws a projectile backwards. After undergoing repairs, it was fitted with those blocks, a folding cage on the turret, and protection for the powertrain. The Stora system was removed. So basically, this is great. They're getting hold of a half-decent Russian tank here and utilizing it themselves. Unmanned systems forces have released new footage. This footage shows operators of Ukraine's 412th Nemesis Brigade destroying 2 Russian Tor M1s, these are air defense systems, and 1 advanced Buk M3 using drones. The strikes were carried out by the Asgard battalion there. So that's really good news. They're still attriting the Russian air defenses, degrading their capabilities. So anyway, that's that. You can see here more and more things getting taken out there. I'll let that run through to pretty much the end. This is the Buk M3, which is the better, I presume, the better of those systems, and that gets taken out too. Okay, just going to show you, and I've done this a number of times, but this is in the Kupiansk area where both sides are deploying. Says Noel reports massive amounts of fiber optic drones to guide first-person or fiber optics, even fiber cabling to deploy these drones, and the landscape just looks like a massive spider's web. I mean, this is pretty incredible footage there showing the prevalence of fiber optic drones. Imagine being, bird life, trying to live in this area, just being sliced up by these cables as you try to land or fly about. Really difficult there. That's, again, like I've said before, something the Ukrainians are going to have to work on after the end of the war. Now, another Russian Il-76 has crashed. This is in Sudan, like another one in Sudan. So one was, well, actually, I think it might be shot down. The entire crew died in the crash of an Il-76 military aircraft in Sudan. It crashed near Port Sudan. All the crew members were killed. It crashed shortly after takeoff. Military source told the publication that the Il-76 crashed while attempting to land. I presume it had, someone says, well, it did land in a certain way. I presume it had Russian military on board, and that anything like that still helps the Ukrainians. Any kind of Russian influence abroad needs to be curtailed. Right, then we're going to get onto distant strikes, and really not a lot to report in terms of actual information, what happened last night. A few other things to talk about. Russia launched 80 drones overnight, which is a relatively small number of drones. Around 50 Shaheds were in that. These were from Kursk, Primorsko, Akhtarsk, Milarovo, so same old places, and occupied Crimea. Ukrainian air defense shot down or jammed 50 drones over the south and east. Strikes hit 7 locations. So you've got 30 drones out of 80, which is not a good interception rate. I mean, that's going to be, what, 60-odd%, something like that, which is not great. So you still got 30 getting through, even though there are only 80. Usually we have, say, 125 and 27 get through, something like that, where we've got 30 getting through with only 80. So maybe many of them were hitting near the front line. I really don't know. Really don't have much information. So I might just check the socials quickly now after we go through this section. This footage is not good news. This is an interceptor drone, a Ukrainian FPV interceptor drone, capturing the moment a Russian Shahed 136 loitering munition released what appeared to be sub-munitions, possibly cluster type, just before the impact of the interceptor drone. Another sign that Russia is modifying its drones for broader area damage. We're seeing these Shahed drones with cluster munitions, with air-to-air missiles on. We're seeing them with jet engines. We're seeing them with rear-facing cameras. We're seeing them with FPV mounted cameras, or cameras that give them the ability to become FPV drones, and then hijack the local mobile phone coverage. This is worrying. The Russians are doing a good job of making the Ukrainians have to adapt all the time to these latest changes. Now, Zelensky says Ukraine is ready for an energy ceasefire. This goes back to my original claims that I think Ukraine is really hurting. I think the energy strikes have taken out 100% of their gas production and are just systematically going around different regions, taking out energy infrastructure to the point that it is really hurting for the Ukrainians. Russia keeps striking. Quote, we only see their strikes. This doesn't suggest Russia is interested in the peace process. So in other words, we don't see them make any concessions in the peace negotiations. They're not interested in peace. All we see is their strikes. We only see their strikes. His office was blunter, quote, constant attacks are the only way for Russia to push its demands on Ukraine. Putin doesn't want to cease fire under any circumstances until he achieves his ultimatums. The office also debunked claims Ukraine rejected an August ceasefire proposal, calling it fake. Russia violated the Trump-brokered March ceasefire more than 30 times before it collapsed in April. So Russia are the ones consistently in the wrong there. Now, Russia strikes Ukraine's gas infrastructure again. This emerged after the strikes from 2 nights ago. The critical equipment that ensures uninterrupted gas supply to the population was hit. There are no injuries among the workers. At the same time, there is destruction at the facilities. In other words, there is interruption of gas supply now to the population. I don't know where that was, but it's yet another example of how Russia is successfully hammering and degrading Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Zelensky confirmed Ukraine, and this is, I think, this is where we start getting at least a little bit positive about what's going on with Ukraine. Zelensky confirmed Ukraine is hitting back at Russia's energy infrastructure in response to ongoing attacks, but said Kyiv is open to an energy ceasefire if Moscow is ready to stop. He also mentioned the use of various types of missiles, adding with a smile, let the enemy keep thinking it's Neptune. So he's saying that they think it's just Neptune, but actually we're using a whole bunch of stuff. He said there are many moments when our enemy believes that the Neptunes were used, and let them continue to believe so. Today, Ukraine is already using Neptunes, Paliantsia, Flamingo, and Syrsky. So the Syrsky is and this is the first time we've heard him, I think, use that term and admit that they are using these. So these are arguably the Grim 2 or the Grom 2, which means thunder, I think, in Ukrainian missiles. These are the Syrsky is what they were developing before this war, or before this iteration of the war. And there are consistently rumors that they have developed it properly now and they are using it. But quite often we just hear that, oh, that was a Neptune, that was a long Neptune. So he says we are using Neptunes, but also Paliantsia, which are these drone missile hybrids, Flamingo, which is the FP5 cruise missile with a 1,150 kilogram warhead, and the Syrsky, which is a ballistic missile, isn't it? So if we look at Syrsky missile, the Hrim 2, there we go, and it is an operational tactical missile system. Is it called? It doesn't call it ballistic here. Is it? Yeah, ballistic is a short range. Yeah, it's a short range ballistic missile, which means that it won't go into the Earth's atmosphere, but it will have a ballistic trajectory and it'll be very hard to be shot down. So they are using that apparently. So that is a really big claim, I think, from Zelensky there. And we are waiting for them to properly scale up production of these. And then we're hearing about the FP7, the FP9, these ballistic missiles that are going to be coming online sometime next year. The FP7 has been codified, as we keep getting told, by the Ministry of Defense, and that will be effectively, I think, available by the end of this year for the Ukrainians to use. And then you could see some turning of the tables to some degree, because there is an asymmetry that still exists, where the Russians have been using ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and Shahed drones to huge degrees and numbers since, effectively the beginning of the war. And Ukraine, 4 years later, is just catching up now to be able to use these. Yes, they've used ATACMS ballistic missiles previously, but not a huge number. And Russia keeps sending them in every bleeding night, virtually, or nearly. And that is a massive advantage to the Russians. The Ukrainians really need to close that gap, and hopefully that will come soon. But then you're like, well, if they sign up to a peace deal, then you get all these missiles coming online, and then they can't use them because they've just done a ceasefire on energy infrastructure. Maybe that will be the first thing, or maybe a full-on ceasefire and a truce, and then but I guess then they can just ramp up production of this stuff, and they act as a deterrent. If you do attack us again, we will obliterate you with all of our new indigenously manufactured ballistic missiles that we don't need permission to use to strike Moscow. You do that to us again, so there is definitely a use, a really serious utility for them, scaling up right now as soon as they can, because even if there are peace deals, then it becomes a deterrent. Now, we hear that the Syzran oil refinery has been shut down. Bingo says no reports of Ukrainian drone strike on December the 5th shut down Russia's Syzran oil refinery. According to Reuters, the attack hit the CDU-6 distillation unit, the same one damaged in August, and repairs could take up to a month. Syzran is owned by Rosneft and processes about 90,000 barrels per day. So that's good news. And here we go. By the end of the year, we hope to codify the FP7 ballistic missile. So just to remind you of that, that was what I was talking about. If there's a request and there is money, so again, it's all about money. We're going to talk about how desperate Ukraine is for money. So that's a third part of this. So you've got the desperation of boots on the ground and losing territory, albeit slowly. You've got the energy desperation, and you have the financial desperation. And of course, with the energy desperation, Ukraine is having to spend much more on buying in gas imports. So it's a double whammy. Anyway, here, if there's a request and there is money, somewhere from May, we can switch to mass serial production of these missiles, hundreds per month. So that is like, what, 100 a month would be over 3 a day. Hundreds a month would be at least 6 a day. So you're talking 6 onwards a day of ballistic missiles that would be produced. And that's looking at a usage that would be on par with the Russians, I would argue. Goodness me. FP7 would have a range of 200 kilometers, so it is a short range one. So that would be mainly across the border into occupied territories. 150 kilogram warhead. FP9 much longer, 855 kilometers, 800 kilogram warhead. So that's double an Iskander, that FP9. Wow. Status June 2026, but the status for the shorter range one is imminent. Design potentially S-400 derived design with Ukrainian flight control and targeting systems, composite structures for weight savings. So, this is where we're at in a war, which is this really precarious situation where Ukraine are on the cusp of developing new weapons and new capabilities, and Russia is on the cusp of causing Ukraine to be in deep, deep trouble with energy and with their own personnel, whilst at the same time, Russia is in deep trouble with its economy and its own personnel and material issues, but they can mitigate that. Okay, so hopefully this all makes sense. We're going to get on to Russia's pressure cooker issue of, and I know people have said pressure cookers are designed to take pressure, they don't blow the lids off. Yeah, but you have too much pressure, that lid will blow. Okay, so we'll get it onto the economy in a second. Now we're going to just look at issues that are going on outside of, and we've already talked about Sudan, but outside of Ukraine and Russia, which should suggest to the United States that maybe Russia should have featured a little bit more in your national security strategy, because they are a challenge to global security. 9 Chinese and Russian military aircraft entered South Korea's air defense identification zone over waters in the east and south of the country, according to Yonhap. Now, South Korea is a big ally of the US, but the US appears to be just letting them get on with it in the South Indo-Pacific. I don't know. At about 10 a.m. on December the 9th local time, 2 Chinese and 7 Russian aircraft entered that zone. Then we hear that Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said Russian African Corps in Mali is repeating crimes committed in Ukraine, killing civilians and abusing there. Earlier, the Associated Press report revealed the atrocities with refugees, describing horrors brought to their country by Russians. So there's issues in the Sahel region where the US did have, anti-terrorist drone bases and whatnot there. They are getting pushed out the Sahel region themselves. And then we have actually, I was going to have this on later, but I think this is a good time to talk about this. In July 2024, DHL parcels exploded in logistics centers in the UK, if you remember, Poland and Germany. So 3 countries had an issue with these exploding before they made it onto the DHL planes. Each of them was powerful enough to have brought down a cargo plane that had they detonated on board, says the Financial Times. Security services would eventually trace the plot back to a group of Russian directed saboteurs. That was enough to give them the capability for what security officials told the Financial Times was the next stage of the plan to attack flights to the US and cause more disruption to the airline industry than any act of terror since the World Trade Center attacks. Now, just to hammer that home, the next stage of the plan was to attack flights to the US. These are US bound flights. This is Russia behind what would uncertainly have, attacks on planes that would certainly have US citizens on board. The US just released a national security strategy coddling Russia while villainizing Europe for its domestic politics, says Karim Rifai. Meanwhile, Russia planned to bomb US-bound flights. Step back and consider which of these things may be of more of a direct threat to the United States. The US is saying that Europe is a threat to the United States because they're too liberal, they're not right-wing enough. Meanwhile, Russia, they're fine by us, and there's no denigration of Russia inside the national security strategy. Meanwhile, we're understanding that the Russians were open to bombing US-bound flights. Somebody make this make sense. And I'm going to play you some brilliant analysis from Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart on that national security strategy again, because I've done a lot of talking about that, but there's a bit more to come in a geopolitical update next. So security service has arrested a Russian shadow fleet vessel in Odessa port, or it's in imposed restrictions on it. Impounded, that's a word. It was illegally transporting Ukrainian agricultural product from occupied Crimea. The vessel's owner was under Ukrainian sanctions. The vessel arrived under the flag of an African country to take a shipping of steel pipes. So it's quite risky to take what might be seen as stolen Ukrainian agricultural produce, then bring it to Odessa to pick up some pipes. And actually, it's a sanctioned, or at least the owner is sanctioned, and it's a shadow fleet member. So, yeah, no wonder that's been impounded. And I guess I wonder if the Ukrainians can say, and we're going to take that grain or that agricultural product. I don't know whether it's like sunflower oil. We're going to take that, and because that's ours, thank you very much, and we're going to sell it ourselves. Okay, so Russian economy is in trouble. And so this is the other part of the calculation, which is, it's precarious. It's so precarious. The Ukrainians definitely want there to be peace, I think. But also they understand that the Russians are so close to being in serious trouble. Some numbers from the Russian budget for January to November 2025, says Anton Gerashenko. Oil and gas revenues fell by 22.4%. In November alone, they fell by 34%. Euro's crude oil has plummeted by 18% compared to October. Revenue over the first 11 months of 2025 grew by just 0.7% compared to the same period in 2024 and dropped over the last 3 months. Expenditures rose by 12.5%. However, in the past 3 months, Russia spent less than in 2024. Looked like it's cutting back, probably on social programs or similar things. Now, this is really, really important. I'm going to show you a graph in a minute that I think shows this, but I hope I make sense and I'm telling you the right things. The budget deficit for the first 11 months increased to 4.3 trillion rubles, about $55.5 billion. By the end of 2025, the deficit might reach about $96 billion. The Russian government officials are talking about growth in various economy sectors, but there's a catch. The growth is negative. Okay, so where am I? I think it's this one. Yes. Okay, so Yevgen Istrubin talks about this, and today the results of Russia's federal budget execution for November were released. Here's a thread. The revenue is around 0% change year on year. So there's no change in the amount of money they're getting in, but expenses negative 12% year on year. So, and I think that's negative means that because you could read that as the expenses going down. That's a 12% drop in expenses is a sensation. So actually, I don't know whether Anton Gerashenko didn't quite. He says expenditures rose by 12.5%, but then in the past 3 months has spent less. I don't know if there's some confusion here over what negative 12 might mean or whether these are two different numbers. But anyway, let's get into Istrubin's details. Revenues for November did not increase. In just 11 months, federal budget revenues grew by a mere 0.7%. Russia has entered a recession, is what Istrubin is saying. So the budget deficit in November was small, only $86 billion, but this was caused by a 12% year-on-year reduction in expenditure. So what Istrubin is saying is that and this could be just for November, right? So actually, Gerashenko could be right, because he says, however, in the past 3 months, Russia spent less than in 2024. So both these things could be right. So the way I understand this is that, and here we have the budget surplus or deficit in billions of rubles. And so in 2021, they made a profit, if you like. The government made a profit, but then in every other year, they made a real significant loss. There's a deficit, mainly due to what took place towards the end of the year. So there must be some way that they do the accounting that things go south in December. So I don't know if they add on all of their, I don't know, expenditures. There's a big expenditure comes in December, whatever. But you can look, there's a precipitous drop every December, and you imagine that's going to be the case here. In the red line is this year. So this year, it has been trending below every other year, particularly since May, right? They are losing money. But what they've done in the last 3 months is that they've got a handle on their expenditure. But the problem there is you're talking about austerity. And this is what happened in the 2008 recession in the UK. Our Conservative government decided the way that we're going to handle this is not to spend money. We're spending too much money. They use the credit card analogy. Look, household bills have gone up. We need to curtail our spending. But by curtailing your spending and not spending anything, it means you're not putting money into the economy. So you're not stimulating at all, which means no one has money. What you need is a cash injection, arguably, at some point to lift people out of this kind of complete depression. If you just cut and cut and cut, then no one's got the money. You're not spending, you're not paying people to spend money to go out and then spank money in the economy, buy a new TV, go on holiday, all this. You can't do that because no one's spending anything, because it's complete austerity. And you need to climb out of austerity somehow. You need that stimulus. So what the Russians are doing here is they are cutting expenditures, which means they're cutting spending on probably welfare, education, hospitals, education, whatever it is, which means that people in the economy are not going to have money. The revenues aren't coming in, so no one's spending more, or 0.7% supposed increase, but basically you're stagnating and you're cutting back, which means that people are going to have less to spend, which is basically the ingredients you need for a recession. So the overall data is presented in tables. Over just 11 months, revenues grew by 0.7%, he says, while expenditures grew by 12.5%. Yes, so he does agree with this. Is exactly what Gerashenko said. So expenditures did grow, so they spent more. Oh, no, that is a disagreement. So he said expenditures. Oh, no, yeah, that's right. So the government spent more for most of the year, and they didn't get much in, which means you're spending more than you're gaining, arguably. So you got a big deficit, and then they're trying to get a handle on that deficit, which is why you see, I guess, the red line here evening out here at the bottom. So you're getting a handle on what you spend. As a result, the deficit is 3.9 trillion rubles higher than last year, he says. Now, with revenues falling, Russia is forced to begin cutting spending to somehow meet its planned budget deficit. Cutting spending will further weaken fiscal momentum and lead to the economic downturn. All these events are taking place against a backdrop of a meteoric rise in domestic public debt. So bond volume has grown by 100% over 4 years, leading to rising debt servicing costs. So it's now costing the government themselves to borrow lots more. It costs private people lots more to borrow. The rates have gone up. With falling oil prices, declining revenues, and rising debt servicing costs, Russia is heading for a collapse. And then we have, 28% of loans are defaulted on at the moment, private loans. It is really challenging for the Russians. And I think hopefully that should show you, that should indicate all of that. Now, Anna Komsa here says Russia's selling oil now at a loss, according to Bloomberg. Fresh from the Bloomberg Vault, Russian oil prices crater to war-era lows despite record tanker dumps into the sea. Euros are at $38 to $41 a barrel. That's dirt cheap fuel prices for the energy superpower. The collapse accelerates. Reuters is reporting that Russia's Syzran oil refinery, I've already talked about on the Volga, halted processing on December the 5th after Ukrainian drone damaged the core AVT6 unit, 70% of its capacity. This Rosneft beast processes 90,000 barrels a day. It's now offline, slashing output amid November's record 14 refinery hits. Record exports, rock bottom prices. Bloomberg 38 tankers sailed last week, a 3-year high at 3.68 million barrels. Euros at Novorossiysk is at $38 per barrel, down $2.80. At Primorsk, $41 a barrel, down $2.40. Discount to Brent is $25.80 at historic lows. So that Primorsk, the claim here, Primorsk price per barrel is $25.8 below Brent prices, which means that, yeah, you can sell lots of it. You can go and put it out in lots of boats, but you ain't getting much value from it. So exports up, value extremely low, but then you've got a lot of oil stuck at sea. So $180 million barrels of Russian oil is now stuck at sea. Bloomberg says that that's up 28% since August, the highest in 2.5 years. Tankers drift as floating storage while routes stretch toward Asia. Buyers hesitate even at fire sale prices. War chest, more like a war puddle. Quote, Russia is operating at a loss to its own budget. Bloomberg admits it. Moscow floods markets with cheap crude just to keep flows alive. Revenues are demolished. Exports are up. Money is down, though. Ukrainian strikes, shadow fleet hits, EU and US insurance bans, and the risk is up. So prices crash. From the shadow fleet to ghost ships, tankers drift for weeks seeking buyers, but even fire sale prices can't offset sanctions risk. And the oil refineries are getting hit. Gasoline shortages are brewing. Putin's oil backbone is brittle and bone dry. The oil collapse hits the front lines. Hydrocarbon taxes down 34% year on year to $6.7 billion. With oil at war lows, 2025 shortfalls are at $25 billion. Deficits 5.7 trillion rubles and rising. No cash for bonuses, pensions, and prosthetics. Even pro-Kremlin voices whisper, end this special military operation or else. So, verdict, Putin's resilient economy is a myth. Bloomberg seals it. Record volume, zero profits. Empires don't explode. They rot from the revenue first. And this then goes back to, well, goodness me, if Trump then came out after January the 20th and sanctioned the crap out of Russia, they would be in super trouble now, right? They are, and so this goes back to the calculation of what's going on the front lines and whether Ukraine really seriously sues for peace when Russia is so very close to being in an awful lot of trouble, although there are other claims that Russia can keep this going for another 18 months. Right, Kirill Shevchenko says, Ukrainian banks, though, on the other hand, so it's hurting back in Ukraine. They filed a record 100,000 plus lawsuits against debtors in 2025. That's 1.5 times more than last year and the highest in 7 years. Over 70% came from private monobank and A bank and state-owned Privatbank. The surge in litigation highlights a broader economic strain. Real incomes haven't kept pace with inflation. Wartime disruptions have hit small businesses, and repayment capacity is collapsing faster than credit supply adjusts. This is a warning signal of rising household financial distress and a fragile recovery still far from stabilization. Okay, the point is that Russia's economically in trouble, but Ukraine's also hurting as well. Okay, so then we get to this. Today, we do not have the strength and support of allies to return Crimea and other occupied territories, said Zelensky. So Zelensky is now admitting that we can't militarily take back these occupied territories, Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Crimea. We don't have enough troops for it. We cannot militarily do that. And so that's why for months and months and months, I've been saying the only way Ukraine militarily takes back their land is by an economic collapse of Russia. It has to economically collapse, and then you can then walk through the occupied territories. So that's where we're at. He's admitting, like, I feel validated that my entire understanding of the war seems to be what's going on, which is it's totally desperate. They can't militarily do these big counteroffensives to take back land. What they can do is hopefully use missiles and drones and scale up production, get more planes in, and get more drones to replace human beings. But at the end of the day, that will just be active defense, hurting the Russians, treating the Russians at tremendous levels. But even that's not enough to stop the Russians attacking, because they can go and nick people from abroad. So then you need to hit them where it hurts, which is in the pocket. So the war is much more important. So it feels like it's easier to liquidate the office of the president rather than to appoint a new person. So he's not going to appoint someone. It looks to it be in charge of the office of the president to replace Yermak, because these people are super important. This is a critical time. The US did not threaten to close the Pearl program. Okay, so those are things he said. Now, going on to then the money side of things, Zelensky says Ukraine has no choice. It needs funds. So you can see from different indications that Ukraine is obviously financially in all sorts of trouble, but they have the fallback of all of their allies to help. But they need that reparations loan freaking desperately. And the reparations loan, he says, from frozen Russian assets is the path forward. While some EU leaders remain skeptical of the format, he made it clear Europe will never agree on this model or find another. There is no alternative. They will either agree on this model or find another. But he says there is no alternative. We need this. We need this reparations loan. This model has to work. And this is desperate times. Now, the EU, apparently, according to the EU Council President, António Costa, is very close to resolving the issue of frozen Russian assets. And that's really good news. Quote, we are working on refining the legal and technical solution that will ensure the agreement of all, or at least a qualified majority of member states. And that's the key. If they can get this through with a qualified majority, they don't need Hungary to vote on it. Costa expressed confidence that a decision will be adopted by the EU summit on the 18th of December, but added that if necessary, work will continue on the 19th or 20th of December until a positive outcome is reached. So the EU understands that Ukraine has to get some massive funding by the 18th or 19th of December, or there's massive trouble. You know, it's all over. Ukraine needs that money, or Ukraine's government ceases to function. Financial Times says the EU want to adopt a law on the indefinite freezing of Russian assets worth 210 billion euros in an accelerated manner. The reason is to prevent a possible veto by Orban. Such a step should ensure the stability of the EU's position in peace negotiations regarding the war in Ukraine. Okay, so that's more news coming out on that. So hopefully, and I know I really went to town on lots of details here, making this a longer video than usual, but I just wanted to explain all of my understanding of how the war is going at the moment and where it's at. Konstantinivka, by the way, here there's a video just of ground robots being used. That stabilized quite a lot. I was reading an analysis last night to say that actually the Russians have been unable to move greatly there. What else? I'm going to leave you with this. Many soldiers saw a Shahed cutting circles for a very long time. This is a Shahed radio repeater on the mesh network. Its task is to relay the control channel from Russia deep into our country for other Shaheds. It seems like a stupid target, but in fact, it needs to be shot down first. That is fascinating. People were saying, I think Thierry was saying yesterday that drones were surely unable to, get their message back to Russia, but I was talking about hijacking the mobile phone provision in Ukraine. But here the idea is that you've got some kind of repeater Shahed just going in a massive circle, beaming back some kind of message or some comms back to Russia. So yeah, this is the first one that needs shooting down. Goodness me, interesting data there. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon. Just before I leave, please remember to go to atpgeo.com/donate, and you will come across the donation page. And we are presently with Jonathan Fink from Silicon Curtain, almost 10,000 dollars, sorry, in fundraising. So that's absolutely incredible. Thank you so much to everyone. If you go to atpgeo.com / not donate, but UK petition, you will hopefully get to the petition that Mark from the Little Whiskey Shop has started up on change.org, and we've only got a few signatures, so please help out with that and share it. It's not moved a lot, and we want to just try and get this moving. We're hoping to start up, or he's hoping to start up, a proper UK government one, but it takes more time to get vetted. But for the time being, please share the change.org one and sign up And it's a really well presented petition that Mark has put a lot of work into, so that'd be great. atpgeo.com/UK petition, atpgeo.com/donate, and you get to go to both those places. Thank you, take care, speak soon, Doodle Pips.